The morning mist hung heavy over the cobblestone streets of Florence, as Magistrate Pietro di Rosso made his rounds through the market square, his keen eyes scanning the crowd for forbidden finery. It was September 1384, and this stern official from distant Siena had arrived just months earlier to take charge of the Ufficiali della Donne, the office of women, with its impossible task of enforcing the city's increasingly elaborate sumptuary laws. What Pietro didn't yet know was that he was about to face the most cleverly defiant group of lawbreakers in all of medieval Europe, the fashionable ladies of Florence. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. As he approached a woman whose elegant silken hood caught the early light, adorned with what appeared to be costly fringe trim. Forbidden to her social rank, Pietro prepared himself for what should have been a routine fine. "Signora," he called out authoritatively, "that hood violates the city ordinances. I must have your name for the violation records." The woman turned toward him with a smile that was both innocent and knowing. With theatrical precision, she lifted the ornamental fringe from her head and held it up for inspection. "But good sir," she replied sweetly, "this is merely a wreath, not part of my hood at all. And as you can see," she continued, placing it carefully in her basket, "I am not wearing it now." The magistrate found himself standing speechless as she walked away, legally untouchable, leaving him to wonder if he had just witnessed criminal ingenuity or legal scholarship. This was merely the beginning of what would become a legendary battle of wits between the authorities seeking to maintain social order through fashion control and the citizens determined to express themselves despite the law. The story of medieval sumptuary laws, the comprehensive legal codes that governed who could wear which fabrics, colors, and styles, reveals a fascinating world where clothing served as both weapon and armor in the ongoing struggle between individual desire and social control. Long before Pietro di Rosso walked the streets of Renaissance Florence, the seeds of fashion regulation had been planted in the ancient world. In the marble halls of Athens and Rome, legislators had already discovered what would become a fundamental truth. Clothing possesses extraordinary power to communicate status, challenge authority, and shape social relations. The Romans, with their genius for organization and control, developed extensive sumptuary alleges that governed not merely what citizens could wear, but how much they could spend on banquets, jewelry, and even perfumes. The price of maintaining social distinction through clothing was literally measured in lives. Tyrian purple, that most coveted of ancient dyes, demanded a horrific tribute from the sea. Picture the ancient dye makers wading through shallow waters along the Mediterranean coast, collecting tens of thousands of murex shellfish, their hands stained purple from the creatures' crushed bodies. A single gram of pure Tyrian purple required approximately 10,000 of these sea snails, their tiny glands yielding precious drops of dye that would be worth more than gold. In 301 CE, Emperor Diocletian's price edicts reveal the staggering economics of this imperial color. 1 pound of Tyrian purple cost 150,000 denarii, equivalent to 3 pounds of pure gold. For perspective, this meant that dyeing a single toga's border in true imperial purple could cost more than a skilled craftsman's lifetime earnings. Little wonder that Roman law decreed death for unauthorized wearing of this divine color. The shellfish beds around Tyre and Sidon became mountains of discarded shells, some rising 40 meters high, archaeological monuments to humanity's desperate pursuit of visual distinction. The irony was profound. In seeking to elevate themselves above nature through the ultimate luxury, the Romans created industrial devastation that transformed entire coastlines. As the Roman Empire crumbled and Christian influence spread across Europe, the regulation of dress took on new dimensions. The early medieval church, with its emphasis on humility and spiritual rather than material wealth, viewed elaborate clothing with deep suspicion. Yet paradoxically, the church itself became one of the most sophisticated practitioners of dress-based hierarchy, developing intricate systems of vestments that could instantly communicate a cleric's rank, authority, and sacred function. The transformation from Roman sumptuary law to medieval fashion control began with theological arguments that would prove remarkably durable. Pride, the deadliest of sins, manifested itself most visibly through vanity in dress. The Church Fathers argued that excessive attention to clothing represented a dangerous confusion of earthly and spiritual values. As Saint Jerome had written, the dress and the soul correspond, making proper clothing literally a matter of salvation. This theological framework provided the perfect justification for what were essentially political and economic control mechanisms. By the 12th century, a complex web of religious, secular, and guild-based clothing regulations began to emerge across Europe. The concept of ordo, divine ordering of society, meant that attempting to blur social distinctions through inappropriate dress was tantamount to challenging God's plan for humanity. Consider the case of a merchant's wife in 13th century Paris, caught wearing silk imported from distant Constantinople. Her crime was not merely legal, but spiritual. She was disrupting the divinely ordained social hierarchy through her presumptuous display of luxury. The punishment would involve not just fines or confiscation, but potential excommunication, transforming a fashion choice into a crisis of eternal consequence. To understand the full drama of medieval sumptuary laws, we must first journey along the treacherous trade routes that brought exotic materials to European markets. Picture a caravan emerging from the dust of the Silk Road, laden with precious cargo that would reshape the wardrobes of Western nobility. Merchants who survived months of travel through hostile territories, desert storms, and mountain passes arrived in cities like Venice and Genoa carrying more than mere goods. They transported the raw materials of social transformation. The economics were staggering. A bolt of Chinese silk, having traveled thousands of miles through dozens of hands, might cost a European lord the equivalent of an entire village's annual agricultural output. The deep crimson of Kermes-dyed cloth required the bodies of thousands of tiny-scale insects, laboriously collected from Mediterranean holm oaks, and processed through techniques guarded more jealously than military secrets. The brilliant blue of ultramarine came from lapis lazuli mines in distant Afghanistan, each precious stone ground into powder worth more than silver. In the bustling ports of medieval Italy, fortunes were made and lost in the textile trade. Venice controlled the eastern routes, its merchants establishing trade relationships that stretched from England to Constantinople, while Genoa dominated African and Western Mediterranean commerce. These cities became laboratories of luxury, where new techniques of dyeing, weaving, and finishing transformed raw materials into objects of almost supernatural beauty and value. The Flemish cities presented another model entirely. Here, in towns like Bruges and Ghent, master weavers had perfected the art of transforming English wool into cloth, so fine it rivaled silk in its smoothness and took dye with such intensity that it seemed to glow from within. A Flemish woolmaker could spend months creating a single bolt of cloth, each thread individually selected and prepared, each stage of production monitored by guild inspectors whose reputation depended on maintaining standards that had taken generations to develop. But perhaps most fascinating were the guild regulations that governed this trade. The Merchant Tailors' Company of London, known from at least 1300, wielded influence that extended far beyond mere commerce. Guild members progressed through elaborate hierarchies: apprentice, journeyman, master, each rank carrying specific privileges and responsibilities. A master tailor wasn't simply a craftsman, he was a keeper of secrets, guardian of techniques, and arbitrator of fashion that could determine a client's social fate. The guild system created fascinating tensions with sumptuary law. While legal codes might forbid certain fabrics to specific social classes, guild privileges could override these restrictions. A successful tailor, despite his officially modest status, might be permitted to wear fine fabrics as a mark of professional achievement. Guild badges and distinctive colors created their own parallel hierarchy, sometimes contradicting the broader social order that sumptuary laws sought to maintain. No medieval city developed more sophisticated sumptuary laws or more creative methods of evading them than Renaissance Florence. Between 1200 and 1500, the city enacted at least 62 separate pieces of sumptuary legislation, creating a legal maze so complex that enforcement became an art form in itself. The very wealth that made Florence a cultural powerhouse also created its greatest social challenge: how to prevent newly rich merchants from visually competing with hereditary nobility. The story of Pietro di Rosso and his impossible mission provides a perfect window into this world. When his superior called him in after months of fruitless enforcement attempts, Pietro's confession revealed the true nature of his adversaries. "I've spent my whole life studying the law," he admitted, "but next to these women, I feel like I know nothing at all. Your women always find reasons why the laws don't apply to them." The reports from his deputies read like a manual of creative legal interpretation. One woman, caught wearing forbidden buttons, calmly explained that the law applied only to functioning buttons, while her decorative ornaments had no buttonholes and therefore didn't qualify. Another, spotted in what appeared to be illegal ermine, claimed she was actually wearing latizzi, like an animal, successfully exploiting the ambiguous wording of the statute to avoid prosecution. But the Florentine women's resistance went far beyond clever wordplay. They developed elaborate strategies that turned law enforcement into a citywide game of cat and mouse. When spotted by the fashion police, well-dressed ladies would duck into churches, where enforcement officials were forbidden to follow. The sacred space became a sanctuary for secular vanity, with women sometimes spending hours inside, praying perhaps, but more likely waiting for the magistrates to give up and move on. The city responded by installing tamburi, denunciation boxes, where citizens could anonymously report fashion violations. These wooden boxes, scattered throughout Florence, created an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that transformed neighborhoods into networks of fashion espionage. Yet even this system proved ineffective against the determined resistance of Florentine society. Women began traveling in groups, making it difficult to identify individual violators. They varied their routes and timing, making surveillance nearly impossible. Some simply purchased licenses that legally permitted them to wear otherwise forbidden items, treating violations as a form of luxury taxation rather than criminal activity. The psychological warfare was perhaps most evident in the case of the anonymous woman who, when confronted about her ermine, simply raised the question of definition itself. By claiming her fur was latizzi rather than ermine, she wasn't just exploiting a legal loophole. She was challenging the fundamental assumption that material reality could be definitively categorized by law. If the authorities couldn't prove what she was wearing actually was, how could they prosecute what she was wearing at all? While Florentine women perfected the art of legal evasion, the men of Renaissance Genoa demonstrated that sheer persistence could overwhelm any enforcement system. The case of Salvaggio de Asti, recorded in meticulous detail in Genoa's state archives, reveals both the obsessive precision of sumptuary law enforcement and its ultimate futility in the face of determined fashion rebels. On September 15th, 1595, Salvaggio strolled through the square of San Siro, wearing what contemporary observers would have recognized as a deliberately provocative costume. The official record, preserved in the archives with almost loving detail, cataloged his crimes. An embroidered cap, a silk doublet of many colors, with gold buttons on the sleeves, 2 rings with white stones on his fingers, a jerkin and embroidered hose in black silk. Every element of his outfit violated Genoa's sumptuary regulations, administered by the Magistrato delle Pompe, the city's dedicated fashion police. What makes Salvaggio's case extraordinary is not the violation itself, but his response to punishment. 3 days after being fined and warned, he returned to the exact same square, wearing precisely the same illegal outfit. This wasn't absent-mindedness or defiance born of ignorance. It was calculated theatrical performance, a public statement that no law could constrain his right to self-expression. By November, Salvaggio had escalated his rebellion. Now he appeared in San Siro, wearing a leather jerkin that had been impregnated with musk, an expensive perfume that announced his presence from blocks away. The sensory assault was deliberate. If he couldn't be ignored visually, he would make himself impossible to ignore through scent. The fashion police found themselves chasing not just illegal clothing, but an olfactory advertisement for defiance. The Genoese records reveal that Salvaggio was hardly unique. Between 1594 and 1598, the magistrates documented more than 560 contraventions of clothing regulations. The repeat offenders seemed to view fines as a cost of doing business rather than effective deterrence. For men wealthy enough to afford silk velvet embroidered with gold thread, garments that could cost as much as a luxury sports car today, the penalties were merely annoying taxes on their preferred lifestyle. Dr. Giulia Galastro's research into these records has revealed a startling pattern that contradicts centuries of historical assumptions. Contrary to widespread belief that sumptuary laws primarily targeted women, Genoese enforcement records show men outnumbering female offenders by nearly 3-to-1 in clothing violations. This wasn't a matter of men dressing too femininely, as historians had long assumed, but rather men aggressively displaying masculine luxury through expensive black silk garments ornamented with precious metal stitching. The irony is profound. What appeared to modern eyes as relatively sober black clothing was actually the height of conspicuous consumption. Black dyes were among the most difficult to fix effectively, requiring expensive imported materials and sophisticated techniques. A gentleman dressed in black silk wasn't displaying restraint. He was announcing that he could afford the most technically challenging and costly dyeing processes available. While Italian cities battled merchant wealth and artistic expression, England faced different challenges that produced some of medieval Europe's most colorful enforcement stories. The case of Richard Walwayn, arrested in 1565 for wearing a very monstrous and outrageous great pair of hose, provides a perfect example of how sumptuary laws could transform the most intimate aspects of dress into matters of public concern and legal scrutiny. Walwayn's crime lay not in the fabric of his stockings, but in their stuffing. Elizabethan fashion demanded that men's legs appear muscular and shapely, achieved through careful padding of their hose. The law, with characteristic medieval precision, specified exactly how much padding was permitted to each social class. As a servant, a member of the meaner sort, Walwain was legally restricted to hose stuffed with no more than 1.75 yards of material. The arrest itself reveals the intimate nature of sumptuary law enforcement. Fashion police didn't merely observe clothing from a distance. They were authorized to conduct what amounted to clothing inspections, feeling garments to assess their quality, and even measuring padding to ensure legal compliance. Walwain's detention, until he could acquire appropriate replacement clothing, transformed a fashion choice into a crisis of personal liberty. The psychological impact was deliberately theatrical. Public humiliation served as both punishment for the offender and warning to potential violators. When merchant tailor Thomas Bradshaw faced similar charges, his sentence specifically called for public spectacle. All the stuffing and linings of one of his said hose shall be cut and pulled out presently, and he to be put in his doublet and hose, and so led home through the street to his missus' house. The image of Bradshaw being marched through London with his deflated hose flapping around his legs would have provided both entertainment and education for the crowds. These cases reveal the profound anxiety that underlay English sumptuary law. The fear wasn't simply of social disruption, but of the collapse of visual truth itself. If a servant could make his legs appear as muscular as a nobleman's through clever padding, what other deceptions might clothing enable? The law sought to ensure that bodies, like souls, could not lie about their true nature. The enforcement of hose regulations also reveals the gender dimensions of sumptuary law anxiety. Male fashion in the Elizabethan period was remarkably flamboyant, with padded doublets creating artificial broad chests and shoulders, while hose created the illusion of powerful legs. The law attempted to ensure that these artificial enhancements remained proportionate to actual social status. A servant might improve his appearance, but not to the extent that he could be mistaken for his social superiors. Of all the elements regulated by medieval sumptuary laws, none carried more psychological and political weight than color. The story of purple dye provides perhaps the most dramatic example of how medieval society transformed natural materials into instruments of power. To understand the full impact of color restrictions, we must journey to the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean, where ancient dye makers performed what amounted to industrial-scale slaughter in pursuit of the ultimate luxury. The process began in the shallow waters, where murex shellfish lived in vast colonies, their shells creating underwater cities of potential purple. Dye makers would wade through these waters with specialized tools, crushing thousands of shells to extract the tiny glands that produced the precious secretion. The smell was reportedly unbearable, a combination of rotting seafood and ammonia that could be detected from miles away. The dye makers themselves became permanently stained, their hands and arms taking on a purple hue that marked them as clearly as any guild badge. The mathematics of murder were staggering. 10,000 murex shellfish yielded approximately 1 gram of pure dye, enough to color perhaps the hem of a single garment in deep, lasting purple. The mountains of discarded shells that accumulated around ancient dye works, some reaching heights of 40 meters, represented the systematic destruction of marine ecosystems in service of human vanity. Yet the psychological impact of the resulting color was so powerful that emperors considered the environmental cost worthwhile. Modern attempts to recreate authentic Tyrian purple reveal why medieval laws treated this color with such reverence and fear. Mohammed Ghassan Nouira, one of the few contemporary artisans still producing true Tyrian purple in Tunisia, can process 45 kilograms of murex snails to produce a single gram of pure extract, which sells for nearly $3,000. The process requires months of careful preparation, with the extracted glands fermented under precise conditions that ancient craftsmen guarded as jealously as military secrets. The psychological impact of genuine Tyrian purple was unlike any other medieval dye. Unlike plant-based colors that might fade or change hue, Murex purple actually improved with age and washing, becoming more vibrant over time. The color itself seemed to possess an almost supernatural quality, appearing different shades depending on the light and angle of view, creating an optical effect that enhanced the wearer's presence in any room. Medieval laws consistently reserved the deepest purples for the highest authorities, but the regulations were more sophisticated than simple prohibition. Different shades carried different meanings and permissions. Bishops might wear purple robes, but not the deep Tyrian purple reserved for emperors. Cardinals wore scarlet, technically red, but produced through processes almost as expensive as purple itself. The result was a visual hierarchy where trained observers could determine not just social status, but specific rank within complex institutional structures. The collapse of Byzantine purple production in the 15th century created a crisis that reveals how deeply color was embedded in medieval power structures. When Constantinople fell in 1453, European access to traditional Tyrian purple effectively ended. Pope Paul II's 1464 decree that cardinals should abandon purple for scarlet wasn't merely a fashion change. It was an acknowledgement that political upheaval had disrupted centuries of visual tradition. The Church's response was to create new color hierarchies, assigning purple to the lower-ranking bishops while reserving scarlet for cardinals, essentially inverting the traditional spectrum. The psychological warfare of color extended beyond purple to encompass the full rainbow of medieval dyes. Scarlet red, produced from Kermes insects, required the collection and processing of thousands of tiny creatures that lived on specific oak trees. The brilliant blue, achieved through ultramarine, demanded lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, each stone representing months of dangerous travel along trade routes. Even apparently modest colors carried hidden meanings. The sober black silk, favored by wealthy merchants, was actually among the most expensive dyes to produce and maintain. The medieval guild system created parallel hierarchies that sometimes supported and sometimes subverted broader sumptuary law objectives. Within the closed world of professional associations, clothing served multiple functions: identifying craft specialization, advertising skill level, maintaining quality standards, and creating bonds between members that often transcended traditional social boundaries. Consider the daily life of Master Giovanni, a Florentine silk weaver, whose workshop operated in the shadow of the great cathedral. Giovanni's clothing told a complex story that sumptuary law officials had to interpret carefully. His wool tunic, dyed a rich brown using imported madder root, announced his prosperity, but remained within legal bounds for his official social status. However, the silk thread embroidered around his sleeves, produced in his own workshop, represented both advertisement and privilege. Guild regulations permitted craftsmen to display samples of their work, creating an exception to general sumptuary restrictions. The silk itself told its own story of global interconnection and local expertise. Giovanni's workshop imported raw silk cocoons from regions as distant as China and Persia, each shipment representing months of travel and negotiation. The young apprentices in his workshop learned not just weaving techniques but the subtle art of fiber evaluation, how to detect the quality of silk by touch, how to identify the origin of different batches by their texture and sheen, how to predict how specific fibers would accept different dyes. The transformation of cocoon to luxury fabric required knowledge that guilds protected more carefully than religious secrets. The process began with killing the pupae inside each cocoon through careful heat application. Too much heat would damage the fiber. Too little would allow the insect to emerge and break the continuous strand. Master weavers could evaluate thousands of cocoons by touch, selecting only those that would produce the strongest, finest thread. The dyeing process represented perhaps the greatest concentration of guild secrets. Master dyers, like Paolo De Nero, maintained workshops that resembled alchemical laboratories, with rows of ceramic vessels containing fermenting dye baths, each one representing months of preparation. The precise timing of fiber immersion, the temperature of the dye bath, the specific combinations of mordants that would make colors permanent. All of this knowledge passed from master to apprentice through years of careful observation and practice. Guild clothing regulations created fascinating legal puzzles for sumptuary law enforcement. A successful dyer might be permitted to wear samples of his finest work, displaying colors and fabric qualities that would be illegal for someone of his official social rank. Guild badges, often made from precious metals and decorated with gemstones, could exceed the jewelry restrictions that applied to other citizens. Professional tools, the specialized scissors of a master tailor, the measuring devices of a cloth merchant, might be decorated with precious materials as marks of achievement. The Merchant Tailors' Company of London exemplified the evolution of guild influence. Originally known as the Fraternity of St. John the Baptist, the organization developed from a religious association into a powerful commercial entity that could challenge traditional aristocratic privilege. Master tailors within the guild possessed knowledge that made them indispensable to the nobility. They understood how to cut and construct garments that would enhance their clients' appearance while adhering to the letter of sumptuary law. This technical knowledge created interesting power dynamics. A master tailor might be socially inferior to his noble clients, but his expertise made him a collaborator in their fashion choices, rather than merely a servant. The tailor's understanding of fabric draping, his knowledge of which cuts would flatter specific body types, his ability to incorporate expensive materials in ways that maximize their visual impact. All of this represented a form of cultural capital that could transcend traditional social boundaries. The day-to-day reality of sumptuary law enforcement reveals the profound challenges that medieval authorities faced when attempting to control personal expression through legal regulation. The fashion police of cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa operated in a world where every citizen was potentially both a violator and an informant, where legal technicalities could transform obvious crimes into complex philosophical questions about the nature of material reality itself. Consider a typical morning patrol by the Florentine Ufficiali del Don. Armed with detailed knowledge of the city's complex regulations, officers would position themselves at strategic points, market squares, church steps, festival locations, where fashionably dressed citizens were likely to gather. Their training included not just legal expertise, but practical skills that bordered on textile forensics. They needed to distinguish between silk and high-quality wool by sight and touch, to recognize the subtle differences between legal and illegal dyes, to estimate the value of jewelry and accessories accurately enough to determine whether violations had occurred. The enforcement officers carried measuring devices to check the length of trains on women's gowns, the width of sleeve openings, the height of headdresses. They maintained reference samples of permitted fabrics and colors, essentially creating portable laboratories for on-the-spot legal determinations. The most experienced officers could evaluate a complete outfit in seconds, identifying multiple potential violations while the wearer remained unaware of the scrutiny. But the citizens being policed were equally sophisticated in their understanding of the legal landscape. Wealthy women traveled with their own legal advisors, sometimes professional lawyers, sometimes simply friends with extensive knowledge of sumptuary law precedents. They carried documentation of their family status, income levels, and any special permissions that might exempt them from standard restrictions. Some maintained multiple wardrobes, keeping legal alternatives readily available in case their preferred outfits attracted unwanted official attention. The cat-and-mouse game between enforcers and citizens created a strange form of street theater. In Venice, women developed the practice of wearing cloaks that could conceal expensive clothing until they reached their destinations. In Genoa, men like Salvaggio d'Asti turned violation into performance art, using their illegal clothing as props in public displays of defiance. In Florence, the most creative women perfected the art of instantaneous costume change, transforming legal outfits into illegal ones through the addition or removal of specific accessories. The economic dimensions of enforcement created additional complications. Cities often relied on fines and confiscations to fund their regulatory systems, creating perverse incentives where successful enforcement generated revenue that supported expanded enforcement capacity. Some wealthy citizens simply incorporated fines into their fashion budgets, treating violations as a form of luxury taxation. Others discovered that purchasing official licenses was more cost-effective than constant legal compliance. The social dynamics of enforcement proved even more complex. Neighbors who might report violations often hoped to emulate the styles they were denouncing. Local officials, dependent on community support, frequently avoided enforcing unpopular laws that could generate social tension. The most successful enforcement relied on creating community pressure for compliance rather than purely legal sanctions. The diversity of medieval sumptuary laws across different regions reveals how local conditions, cultural values, and economic structures shaped the development of fashion control systems. Each region developed its own approach to balancing social stability, economic protection, and individual expression, creating a patchwork of regulations that tells the story of medieval Europe's complex political and cultural evolution. German and other Germanic regions took a notably different approach from their Western neighbors, enacting fewer sumptuary laws, but often with greater specificity when they did intervene. A 14th century German regulation that allowed noblewomen to wear only one brooch of silver or gold, with specific weight restrictions of no more than 1 heller, demonstrates the precise, almost scientific approach that characterized Germanic legal tradition. Similarly, silver girdles were permitted but limited to a value of 1 mark, creating a system where luxury was controlled through precise economic measurements rather than blanket prohibitions. The Germanic approach reflected different social structures, particularly the strength of guild systems that provided alternative frameworks for regulating dress within professional groups. Unlike Italian cities, where merchant wealth created constant pressure against aristocratic privilege, Germanic regions maintained more stable social hierarchies, where traditional authority structures faced less challenge from commercial success. French sumptuary legislation focused primarily on protecting the visual distinction between hereditary nobility and the rising bourgeoisie, creating some of the most politically motivated fashion regulations in medieval Europe. A 13th century law that barred the burgher class from wearing gold, silver, or precious stones in public wasn't just about luxury control. It was about preventing wealthy merchants from visually competing with aristocratic authority. The 14th century regulations, specifically targeting prostitutes, banning them from wearing gold buttons, silver items, and pearls, reveal how clothing restrictions could serve multiple social control functions simultaneously. The French system was notable for its comprehensive approach, regulating not only clothing but table expenses, the foods that could be consumed by different social ranks. This holistic approach to luxury regulation reflected the French monarchy's desire to control all aspects of conspicuous consumption that might challenge royal authority. The requirement that notaries report violations and the threat of punishment for police officers or judges who failed to enforce the laws created a system of official accountability that was rare in medieval legal structures. Spanish regions developed their own unique approaches, often influenced by contact with Islamic cultures and the complex social dynamics created by the Reconquista. Spanish sumptuary laws frequently included specific provisions for religious minorities, creating systems where clothing served not just to maintain social hierarchy, but to enforce religious and ethnic distinctions. The requirement that Jews wear specific badges or distinctive clothing, while Muslims faced similar restrictions, transformed fashion regulation into a tool of religious and ethnic control. English sumptuary laws represented perhaps the most economically motivated system in medieval Europe. The 1337 and 1363 statutes passed during Edward III's reign explicitly aimed to promote English garments and preserve class distinctions by means of costume. This combination of economic protectionism and social control created some of the most detailed sumptuary legislation in medieval Europe, with regulations that broke down social classes based on complex combinations of rank, occupation, and income. The English income-based approach to sumptuary law was revolutionary for its time. The 1463 statute that allowed members of the gentry to wear damask or plain satin, but only if their annual income exceeded £40, represented an early form of means testing that acknowledged the growing commercial economy. This system attempted to accommodate wealthy merchants within existing social hierarchies while maintaining traditional distinctions between hereditary and commercial status. English enforcement relied heavily on local officials, with justices of the peace given authority to punish offenders and responsibility distributed among clergy, masters, and even neighbors. This decentralized approach reflected English political traditions of local governance, but it also created enforcement challenges, as local officials proved reluctant to prosecute unpopular laws against their own communities. The most extreme regional variations appeared in the punishment systems that different areas developed. Italian cities favored monetary fines and public humiliation, often combined with confiscation of illegal garments. Spanish regions sometimes imposed more severe physical punishments, particularly for religious minorities who violated dress codes. German regions often relied on guild-based sanctions that could include loss of professional privileges. English authorities developed perhaps the most theatrical punishment systems, with public humiliation designed to provide both entertainment and education for community members. The gendered nature of medieval sumptuary law enforcement reveals profound anxieties about female sexuality, social mobility, and the proper ordering of patriarchal society. While these laws technically applied to both sexes, the overwhelming majority of enforcement actions targeted women, reflecting both practical considerations. Women's fashion was more varied and visible, and deeper cultural concerns about female vanity, pride, and the potential for clothing to disrupt social order. The theological foundations for gendered enforcement were deeply embedded in medieval Christian thought. Church authorities viewed excessive attention to clothing and appearance as particularly dangerous for women, who were seen as more susceptible to the sin of pride and more likely to use their appearance to tempt men into sin. This theological framework provided moral justification for legal restrictions that often went far beyond what was imposed on men. The case of Margherita di Francesco, a Florentine merchant's wife, arrested in 1395 for wearing a silk gown with silver trim, illustrates the complex intersection of gender, class, and law that characterized women's experience with sumptuary legislation. Margherita's husband, a successful wool trader, possessed sufficient wealth to purchase the forbidden garment. But the law specifically prohibited women of the merchant class from displaying their family's prosperity through dress. The restriction wasn't about the family's ability to afford luxury. It was about preventing women from visually communicating their household's economic success in ways that might challenge aristocratic privilege. The enforcement process itself was deeply gendered and often invasive. Women suspected of violations faced physical inspection of their clothing by officials who were authorized to touch fabrics, examine seams, and even measure the weight of jewelry to determine its value. These inspections, conducted in public spaces, transformed women's bodies into sites of legal scrutiny where intimate details of dress became matters of civic concern. The psychological impact on women was profound. In a society where marriage prospects, social acceptance, and personal identity were closely tied to appearance, sumptuary law violations could have consequences that extended far beyond legal penalties. A woman publicly humiliated for fashion violations might find her reputation damaged in ways that affected her family's social standing, her daughter's marriage prospects, and her own position within community networks. Women's responses to these restrictions demonstrate remarkable creativity and determination. The Florentine ladies who perfected the art of legal evasion were engaging in a sophisticated form of resistance that combined legal scholarship, performance art, and collective action. Their strategies: ducking into churches to avoid fashion police, exploiting legal loopholes through creative interpretation, organizing group activities that made individual enforcement difficult, represented a form of organized resistance to patriarchal control. The church sanctuary strategy was particularly brilliant because it exploited the tension between secular and religious authority. Fashion police were forbidden from entering consecrated spaces, but women could enter churches freely as part of their expected religious devotions. By timing their church attendance to coincide with enforcement patrols, women could maintain their fashion choices while appearing to engage in pious behavior. The gendered nature of sumptuary law also reveals anxieties about female economic power. Many of the most creative resistors were married to successful merchants whose wealth could rival or exceed that of traditional nobility. These women's fashion choices represented a form of economic display that challenged the assumption that social status was purely hereditary. Their expensive clothing announced that commercial success could create its own forms of power and prestige. The regulation of female clothing also served to reinforce gender hierarchies within families. Laws frequently held husbands responsible for their wives' compliance with dress codes, making men responsible for controlling female behavior and appearance. This legal structure reinforced patriarchal authority by making the household head accountable for the actions of all family members, while simultaneously suggesting that women lacked the moral judgment to regulate their own behavior. The most dramatic gendered enforcement involved unmarried women, who faced different restrictions based on their dependent status. Single women often faced more severe limitations than married women of the same economic class, reflecting societal concerns about uncontrolled female sexuality and the need to ensure that unmarried women remained visually distinct from their married counterparts. The clothing restrictions served as a form of social control that reinforced the importance of marriage as the appropriate destination for female ambition. Behind the seemingly frivolous concerns about clothing colors and fabric choices lay serious economic warfare, as medieval governments used sumptuary laws as weapons in their struggles to protect domestic industries, control international trade, and maintain favorable balances of commerce. The story of how fashion became a battlefield reveals the sophisticated understanding that medieval authorities possessed about the relationship between consumption, production, and political power. The English wool trade provides a perfect case study in the economic dimensions of sumptuary legislation. England possessed abundant high-quality wool, but lacked the sophisticated textile processing capabilities that had developed in Flanders and Italian city-states. English sheep produced some of Europe's finest fleece, but English weavers could not match the technical skills of Flemish craftsmen who had perfected techniques for creating cloth so fine it rivaled silk in its smoothness and color-holding capacity. The economic logic of English sumptuary laws becomes clear when viewed through this lens. By restricting the importation and use of foreign luxury textiles, English authorities hoped to force domestic consumption of English products while preventing the outflow of precious metals to foreign suppliers. The 1574 Elizabethan statute that specifically referenced concerns about foreign wares and their threat to English economic stability wasn't merely protectionist. It was an early form of economic warfare designed to strengthen domestic industry at the expense of foreign competitors. The Flemish response to English wool export restrictions demonstrates how sumptuary laws could trigger international economic conflicts. Flemish cities like Bruges and Ghent had built their prosperity on importing English wool and transforming it into luxury textiles that were then exported throughout Europe. When English authorities attempted to restrict raw wool exports to encourage domestic processing, Flemish cities faced economic crisis that threatened their entire social structure. The result was a complex diplomatic dance where trade privileges, military alliances, and fashion regulations became intertwined. Flemish cities offered military support to English kings in exchange for continued wool access. English authorities used wool exports as diplomatic weapons, granting or restricting access based on foreign policy objectives. The clothing that adorned European nobility became a visible symbol of these international negotiations, with specific fabrics and colors carrying implicit political messages about trade relationships and diplomatic alignments. Italian city-states developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to using sumptuary laws for economic advantage. Venice controlled eastern trade routes and used clothing regulations to promote the consumption of goods that passed through Venetian hands, while discouraging alternatives that might benefit rival cities. Genoa, with its dominance of Western Mediterranean and African trade, crafted sumptuary laws that favored the types of luxury goods, spices, dyes, precious metals, that formed the foundation of Genoese commercial success. The economic competition between Italian cities played out in their respective sumptuary codes. Florence, with its dominance of banking and financial services, developed laws that reflected the city's role as a center of commercial innovation. Florentine sumptuary laws were more complex and sophisticated than those of other cities, reflecting the legal and financial expertise that made the city a center of European commerce. The very complexity of Florentine fashion regulations advertised the city's intellectual sophistication and legal innovation. The impact on individual merchants could be dramatic. A Venetian silk trader who had invested months of travel and substantial capital in acquiring Chinese silk might find his potential profits destroyed by sumptuary law changes that restricted the market for his goods. Conversely, A Genoese spice merchant might benefit enormously from regulations that increase demand for the exotic dyestuffs that were his specialty. The guild system added another layer of economic complexity to sumptuary law enforcement. Guilds often possessed economic interests that conflicted with broader policy objectives. A guild of local weavers might support restrictions on imported textiles, while a guild of dyers might oppose limitations on imported dyestuffs. The most successful sumptuary law systems were those that managed to balance these competing economic interests while maintaining their primary social control objectives. The long-term economic impact of sumptuary laws remains debated among historians. Some argue that these regulations protected domestic industries during crucial developmental periods, allowing local craftsmen to develop skills and techniques that eventually made them competitive with foreign suppliers. Others contend that sumptuary laws reduced competitive pressure on domestic industries, discouraging innovation and quality improvement that would have strengthened European textile production. The eventual abandonment of sumptuary laws across Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries wasn't the result of sudden legal or philosophical changes, but rather the gradual recognition that these elaborate systems of social control had become ineffective against the combined forces of economic change, social mobility, and human ingenuity. The story of this collapse reveals as much about medieval society's ultimate dynamism as the laws themselves reveal about its attempts at control. The fundamental problem was economic. Sumptuary laws were designed for a world where luxury goods were genuinely rare and expensive, where the natural exclusivity of materials like silk, purple dye, and precious metals provided automatic barriers to social mobility. But the expansion of international trade, improvements in production techniques, and the accumulation of merchant wealth gradually undermined these natural barriers. Consider the case of purple dye, once the most exclusive color in the medieval palette. For centuries, the restriction of purple to royalty and the highest religious authorities was supported by the genuine difficulty and expense of producing true Tyrian purple. But by the 15th century, new dyeing techniques had made it possible to create purple-appearing fabrics through combinations of cheaper blue and red dyes. While these substitutes lacked the unique properties of true Tyrian purple, its ability to become more vibrant with age and washing, its distinctive color-shifting properties, they were visually similar enough to undermine the exclusivity that sumptuary laws sought to preserve. The political changes of the late medieval and early modern periods also contributed to the decline of sumptuary law effectiveness. As monarchs became more dependent on merchant wealth for financing their increasingly expensive military and administrative operations, they became less willing to alienate wealthy merchants through strict enforcement of dress restrictions. The rise of banking families like the Medici, who could lend money to kings and popes while technically remaining commoners, created a class of individuals whose economic power exceeded that of many traditional nobles, but who remained subject to sumptuary restrictions. The case of James I's abolition of English sumptuary laws in 1604 illustrates this changing political reality. The king's proclamation didn't argue that such laws were philosophically wrong or socially harmful. It simply acknowledged that they had become impossible to enforce effectively and were generating more social tension than social order. The practical recognition that law enforcement had become counterproductive marked the beginning of the end for sumptuary legislation throughout Europe. The cultural changes of the Renaissance also played a role in undermining sumptuary law effectiveness. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement and personal merit conflicted with sumptuary law's assumption that social status was fixed and hereditary. Artists, scholars, and other creative professionals began to argue that their intellectual achievements entitled them to dress in ways that reflected their cultural contributions rather than their birth circumstances. The printing press revolution had an unexpected impact on sumptuary law enforcement. As books became more widely available, legal texts, including sumptuary regulations, became accessible to ordinary citizens. The Florentine women, who became expert amateur lawyers, capable of exploiting legal loopholes and technicalities, were products of this new information age, where legal knowledge was no longer the exclusive province of trained professionals. The technological improvements in textile production also contributed to the collapse of sumptuary law effectiveness. New techniques in spinning, weaving, and dyeing made it possible to produce fabrics that closely resembled expensive luxury materials at much lower costs. The development of New World dyes and the improvement of European dyeing techniques meant that colors previously reserved for the wealthy became accessible to much broader segments of the population. The psychological impact of constant evasion and resistance also played a role in undermining sumptuary law authority. When laws are widely violated without serious consequences, they lose their moral and practical authority. The Florentine women's successful resistance campaigns, Salvaggio de Astes, theatrical defiance, and the general pattern of creative evasion throughout Europe gradually transformed sumptuary laws from serious legal restrictions into something closer to social conventions that could be ignored with minimal risk. The economic costs of enforcement also became prohibitive. Maintaining the complex bureaucratic machinery necessary to monitor compliance with detailed sumptuary regulations required substantial public investment. The fashion police, the inspection systems, the legal apparatus necessary to prosecute violations, all of this represented a significant drain on public resources for regulations that were becoming increasingly ineffective. The abandonment of formal sumptuary laws did not end the human impulse to regulate appearance and expression through clothing, but rather transformed it into new forms that continue to shape contemporary society in ways that would be recognizable to medieval fashion police. The fundamental tensions that drove medieval sumptuary legislation, the desire to maintain social hierarchies, the fear of deceptive appearances, the economic interests that benefit from controlled consumption, persist in modified forms that reveal the enduring relevance of these historical struggles. Modern dress codes in schools, workplaces, and social institutions represent direct descendants of medieval sumptuary thinking. The business suit, with its standardized form and subtle indicators of quality and cost, functions as a contemporary version of guild clothing, identifying professional status while maintaining enough uniformity to prevent excessive individual expression. The restriction of certain types of clothing to specific contexts, formal wear for special events, uniforms for particular professions, modest dress for religious settings, echoes medieval principles of appropriate dress for social roles. The luxury fashion industry itself operates on principles that medieval sumptuary law creators would immediately understand. Designer brands create artificial scarcity through limited production and high prices, using exclusivity as a marketing tool in ways that parallel medieval restrictions on luxury materials. The seasonal cycle of fashion, shows and new collections, mirrors the medieval guild system's control over when and how new styles would be introduced to the market. The psychological dimensions of clothing as identity and status communication remain as powerful today as they were in medieval Florence. Social media has created new forms of appearance-based status competition that would be familiar to the Florentine women who turned fashion law evasion into performance art. The ability of clothing choices to communicate information about wealth, values, affiliations, and aspirations continues to make fashion a site of social tension and regulation. The economic dimensions of fashion regulation have also persisted in modified forms. Trade policies that protect domestic textile industries, regulations governing labeling and advertising of luxury goods, and international disputes over intellectual property in fashion design all echo medieval concerns about economic competition and protection. The globalization of fashion production has created new forms of the same tensions that drove medieval sumptuary laws. Questions about who benefits from luxury consumption, how to maintain domestic employment in textile industries, and whether consumption patterns should be regulated for broader social benefit. The gender dimensions of medieval sumptuary laws find contemporary echoes in ongoing debates about dress codes that disproportionately affect women, workplace appearance standards that enforce gender norms, and the continued use of clothing regulation as a form of social control over female behavior. School dress codes that focus on preventing girls from distracting boys, workplace policies that require women to wear makeup or high heels, and cultural expectations about appropriate dress for different female roles all demonstrate the persistence of gendered clothing regulation. The technological disruption that eventually undermined medieval sumptuary laws offers lessons for understanding contemporary challenges to traditional forms of authority and control. Just as improvements in textile production and dyeing techniques made luxury materials more accessible and harder to regulate, modern technology continues to democratize access to information, materials, and means of production in ways that challenge established hierarchies and control systems. The resistance strategies developed by medieval fashion rebels, legal technicality exploitation, collective action, strategic noncompliance, alternative interpretation of regulations, have become standard tactics in contemporary social movements. The techniques perfected by Florentine women for evading fashion police can be seen in everything, from tax avoidance strategies to civil disobedience campaigns to online privacy protection efforts. Perhaps most importantly, the ultimate failure of medieval sumptuary laws demonstrates both the power and the limitations of using law to control human expression and social mobility. While these laws succeeded in creating elaborate systems of social control and maintaining certain forms of hierarchy for several centuries, they ultimately proved unable to contain the human desires for self-expression, economic advancement, and social mobility that drove their violation. The medieval experiment in comprehensive fashion control offers valuable insights into the relationship between individual freedom and social order that remain relevant for contemporary policy debates. Questions about how much regulation of personal choices is appropriate for social stability, whether economic inequality should be addressed through consumption controls, and how to balance individual expression with community standards, all echo the fundamental issues that drove medieval sumptuary legislation. As the last light faded from the cobblestone streets of medieval Florence, and Magistrate Pietro di Rosso concluded another fruitless day of chasing fashionably defiant women through church doorways and legal loopholes, he perhaps realized that he was fighting a battle that could never truly be won. The human impulse for self-expression, status communication, and social mobility proved stronger than even the most elaborate legal systems designed to contain it. The story of medieval sumptuary laws reveals a fascinating world where clothing served as both weapon and armor in fundamental human struggles over identity, power, and freedom. From the purple-stained hands of ancient dye makers to the theatrical defiance of Renaissance dandies, from the clever legal arguments of Florentine women to the precision measurements of English fashion police, these laws touched every aspect of medieval life and created a complex web of social relations that defined European civilization for centuries. Yet the ultimate lesson of this history is not about the power of law to control human behavior, but about the resilience of human creativity in the face of that control. The women who turned churches into fashion sanctuaries, the men who treated fines as luxury taxes, the craftsmen who exploited guild privileges to exceed their official status. All of these represent the irrepressible human tendency to find ways around restrictions that seem to limit fundamental aspects of identity and expression. The economics of exclusivity that drove medieval sumptuary laws, the transformation of natural scarcity into social hierarchy, the use of trade regulation to protect domestic interests, the deployment of legal complexity to maintain elite privilege, continue to shape contemporary society in ways that would be immediately recognizable to medieval fashion police. The fundamental tensions between individual desire and social order, between economic innovation and traditional authority, between personal expression and community standards, remain as relevant today as they were in the market squares of medieval Europe. The collapse of formal sumptuary law systems by the 17th century marked not the end of clothing-based social control, but its transformation into more subtle and sophisticated forms that continue to shape how we think about dress, status, and appropriate behavior. The legacy of medieval fashion regulation lives on in everything from corporate dress codes to luxury brand marketing, from school uniform policies to social media appearance pressure. Perhaps most importantly, the story of medieval sumptuary laws demonstrates both the power and the ultimate futility of attempts to use legal regulation to freeze social hierarchies and prevent change. While these laws succeeded in maintaining certain forms of order and distinction for several centuries, they ultimately proved unable to contain the dynamic forces of economic growth, social mobility, and cultural change that characterize vibrant societies. The cleverness of the Florentine women, the persistence of Salvaggio d'Aste, the legal creativity of merchants and craftsmen throughout Europe, all of these represent victories of human ingenuity over institutional control, of individual expression over social conformity, of change over stasis. Their stories remind us that the most elaborate systems of control are ultimately dependent on the consent and cooperation of those being controlled, and that when that consent is withdrawn, even the most sophisticated legal frameworks become ineffective. The medieval experiment in comprehensive fashion control offers both warning and inspiration for contemporary policymakers and social reformers. It demonstrates the seductive appeal of using law to address complex social problems, while also revealing the limitations and unintended consequences of regulatory approaches to issues that may be better addressed through cultural change, economic opportunity, and social dialogue. As we face our own challenges with inequality, social mobility, and the proper balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility, the story of medieval sumptuary laws provides valuable perspective on the eternal human struggle to create societies that are both ordered and free, both stable and dynamic, both respectful of tradition and open to change. The fashionable rebels of medieval Europe, in their determination to express themselves despite legal prohibition, remind us that the deepest human values, dignity, creativity, aspiration, identity, cannot be legislated away, only temporarily suppressed until they find new ways to emerge. In the end, the story of medieval sumptuary laws is not really about clothing at all, but about the fundamental human desire to be seen, understood, and respected as individuals, rather than simply as members of predetermined social categories. The purple-clad empress, the cleverly dressed merchant's wife, the defiantly fashionable dandy. All were engaged in the same basic human project of using appearance to communicate their understanding of their own worth and place in the world. That this project ultimately proved stronger than centuries of legal restriction offers both historical insight and contemporary hope for all who struggle to express their authentic selves in the face of systems designed to limit and control human potential. The threads of power that medieval authorities sought to weave through their sumptuary laws ultimately proved less durable than the threads of individual human creativity and determination that their subjects used to unravel those same restrictions. In this eternal dance between control and expression, between authority and resistance, between law and life, medieval Europe created one of history's most fascinating experiments in social engineering and demonstrated conclusively that the human spirit, like fine silk fabric, cannot be contained indefinitely by even the most elaborate attempts at regulation and control.